Now I love woodworking, but there's nothing worse than working with wood, a live material, and having a dull blade. They just don't go well together. You end up tearing things up, you tear up your project. It's not a fun experience. You're trying to ram your tools through the material, and it's just not fun. So let me show you with just real simple tools, a whetstone and a bit of sandpaper, how to bring your tools up to a razor edge. Now this same thing will work for a draw knife, a hand plane, of course, because we're using a hand plane here today for demonstration, and your chisels as well. It'll work. So let's get started. Oh boy, you know it's getting serious when the whiteboard comes out here. So both chisels, draw knives, and hand planes have a similar blade design, and that is they all have what we call a chisel grind. So if this was a cross section of the body of the tool, they all come to an edge like this, whereas a knife would have a symmetrical grind and the center of mass would be down the middle of the tool. A hand plane, like I said, a chisel and a draw knife all have a chisel grind, so you have a flat back and then you have this single edge grind. So that's good in some ways. It's actually much more enjoyable to sharpen, in my opinion, than having a double-edged, than having a two-sided or symmetrical grind. This is a nicer system, but it does need to be sharpened in a certain way. So we'll get started right now. So we have the iron taken out of my lovely old footprint plane there, and this edge is quite dull. It's seen a lot of use, so it has a few little nicks in it, and it's just overall dull. And plus, we're starting to have a little bit of surface rust on there, so we want to get rid of that as soon as possible before we have any pitting or degradation of the material near the edge. So we need to get this sharpened. We're going to do that right now. So now if we're going to be sharpening the flat surfaces, very flat planes of blades like this, we need flat stones. So what we're going to do, okay, this is a nice little trick. Use a pencil and write on your stone there, and then we'll give it a little work on a piece of sandpaper on a flat surface. This is just some standard sandpaper, 220 grit, 400, and some higher grits here. This is for some brass sanding I was doing before. But after just a few strokes on that flat surface, you can see it's very evenly removing the pencil mark, which means this stone is nice and flat. But if you can go ahead and check your faces just to make sure they're nice and flat before you begin, it's a good place to start. Now that we have flat stone faces, we can go ahead and get started with our sharpening. I'm getting started with a 400. You could go lower to a 220, but in general you want to keep down in that range to begin, in my experience. Plain blades like this often have little nicks and dents, and you want something to remove those efficiently. So I'm starting with a 400 here today. It's right in the middle. It's not super aggressive, but it will remove pretty quickly. Now you can buy little fancy angle jigs, and they're not that expensive, but today we're going to do it all by hand. What I'm going to do is take a marker here and just color in. Oh, you can hear how rough that is. Color in the face of that blade. If you had a little bit of blue Dykem or something, you could use that as well, if you guys have that lying around your shop. But we're going to use just a permanent marker. You can see we have our blade colored in red. Now the back of your blade here doesn't really get a whole lot of wear, so we can just rough that up if you'd like. So you're just laying it flat on the stone, putting some pressure down, and we'll just work it a little bit on our stone to make sure we take out any rolls that may be coming around the back side. We also want to make sure we're contacting right out around our edge, like you see there. Notice this scoop where the stone is not touching. That makes complete sense because these blades are hollowed like that usually, to make filing a little easier. Now with that permanent marker colored edge, we're going to lay our blade marker side down, just flat on the surface of the stone like this. Notice the shadow under the edge there. Now what you're going to do is tip the blade up and stop as soon as that shadow disappears. And if your stone is nice and wet like mine, you'll also see a little bit of water peeze up or push up, ripple up at the edge. So here you can see that touch of shadow, and right there is where it disappears. And that is where you need to try to hold your work. Now keep in mind that without an angle jig, you aren't going to get a perfectly flat bevel. Now that's okay, but human error is going to give you some level of convexing. What I've found best, the best way to hold the iron is to tip up like I said, and to have one hand on top creating an even downward pressure, and then have one hand here for pulling and pushing back and forth. So we're going to do what I just said, tip up, right there is where the shadow disappears. We're just going to go forward and back on our stone. Like I said, you are going to fall and steepen a little bit. Try to mitigate that as much as you can. After a few strokes now, let's check what our edge looks like. Now I notice that I have cleaned off all the marker on the front half, but notice we still have some marker remaining back here. So that means I'm putting a little too much pressure on the head of the blade, so I need to kind of reduce that angle just slightly and try again. Now every time you move up in grit to another stone, you can color your edge if you like, but you should get used to holding that angle after a little bit. Now, common questions: how to know when you're done on a single stone or a single grit. So I just finished up with the 400 grit. How do I know I'm done? Well, you need to create 400 grit scratches the entire length of this bevel, and it needs to be nice and even. Of course, you also need to create an apex. So sharpen until both of these surfaces meet into a perfect apex. Your scratch pattern should be nice and even, so I can only see 400 grit scratches now all the way along this blade, front and back. Now you have likely, if you've sharpened right to an apex, you'll have a wiry burr right at your edge, which is very, very grabby. You can even see it or feel it with your fingernail. If you don't have that there, you probably haven't sharpened right to an apex. I have that there. What I'll do is draw my edge lightly, once or twice, through a piece of softwood, and that'll just pull off that burr very delicately. Now what I'll do is a few push strokes on each edge, just a couple. So cutting strokes, I'll say, just like this, and that'll just help firm up the edge we have remaining there. If you've done what I just did, if you've created an apex, lightly remove that burr, and I did those few extra cutting strokes, you should have what feels so sharp. It feels really sharp. It grabs your finger. Now this is a 400 grit. You could stop here. I'm not going to, because I like a polished, smooth edge. I find it leaves a nicer finish on your project. Especially if you're working with a difficult wood like oak, which is really grainy, or a real soft wood like pine, which of course tears. It's such a soft finish. A real smooth edge will create that glossy finish, which is nice. So I'm going to go up on grit here now. That's a 400. This is a combo stone, so I'm just going to switch over. Now we're going to flip over to the 1000 grit side here. Check your stone for flatness. I already did, and we're all good. I'm just dressing up the face of the stone here, getting it ready to cut. And now we can repeat the exact same process, the exact same set of steps we did for the other side. All we're trying to do now is replace the 400 grit scratches with 1000 grit scratches. So that's your goal, is to remove all those 400 grit scratches with 1000 grit scratches. Finish off the same way, get that burr, drag it off the same way, and repeat it until you've gotten to the level of edge you want, whether that's the highest stone you own, or maybe you want to stop early. I have stones up to 8000 grit here today. You do not need to go up that high. That's a bit excessive, but that's where I'm going with this hand plane iron. Now I'm just finishing with the 8000 grit stone here. I'll wipe it off and remember to do the exact same thing. So I'll just lightly drag through a little bit of soft wood just in case any burr developed there. That feels nice and smooth, and now we'll give just a few cutting strokes, cutting only. Strapping strokes at this point tends to redevelop that burr, which I don't want. We want to create a nice hard edge, so we're just cutting strokes. Now, what I've seen other more skilled craftsmen than me do, for example, on the ooh, that feels so sharp. Now, what I've seen some other master woodworkers do, like I believe Lee Nelson has a video out when they're sharpening, they create a micro bevel on that blade. Now, I haven't found it necessary, but I suppose if you were working with a lot harder woods, harder than I have here to work with, it might be more beneficial. What you'd want to do is do that same thing where you tip your blade up till your shadow disappears. Now just tip up just a little bit more and give a few push strokes. Try to maintain that angle. And there, that's enough right there. One last little step here that I think can make all the difference in how your edge performs is a bit of strapping. I just have a bit of red rouge on a rough sided strap. I'll just give that a good scrubbing, trying not to change the angle. Oh yeah, and that's just cleaning everything up real nicely. Okay, so let's see if we can get a quick edge test there. Ooh, that is viciously sharp. Very clean looking. You can see that mild polish, but it just grabs the skin there. This is a beautiful blade now, will perform super well. Some people also break these corners. Again, I haven't found it necessary in my work, but it can make your projects finish a little nicer, a little smoother, and that is just to break these corners here. I would use a little bit of sandpaper, or the side, the edge of your stone here, because I wouldn't want to gouge out the surface of your stone by working on those corners, but you just want to drag those and round them back a little bit so you're not plucking right at that corner, and it just gives a little smoother transition between your plane passes. Well, I hope you guys learned something today. Like I said, you can use those same techniques on draw knives or chisels or anything else with that chisel style edge. One last thing I want to note is that you can see the results we get with a more budget friendly set of whetstones there. Those are fairly cheap whetstones, and you can see that we had superb results, hair shaving results, which is pretty excellent. You don't even need to go that high with your toolkit. Even some sandpaper, although I would argue sandpaper gets more expensive in the long run because you wear it out constantly. But just to get you started, even sandpaper on a flat surface can get you these results no problem. Thank you guys for watching. Hit that like button if you liked it or if you learned something. Comment down below if you have any of your own little tips and tricks. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. We'll see you in the next video.